working on book 2 in the Wrath and Weeping series, which is called Oath of the Wolf. And there was mention of a character being killed with a pair of sheep shears. Death by 1,000 snips. He had it coming, don't worry. But as I have been editing these past months, it occurred to me, were Anglo-Saxon sheep shorn? By extension, would the Anglo-Saxons have had shears? This may sound like a silly question to anyone familiar with Anglo-Saxon textiles. Everyone wore wool in this time period. If you were wealthy enough, you might be able to afford like a linen undershirt or a shift to go under the wool, but everyone was wearing wool, sometimes in multiple layers. So the Anglo-Saxons were definitely using wool, and we know that they were collecting it sometime around midsummer. But were they shearing? Or were they rooing? To explain rooing sheep, we first need to explain some things about sheep. If you've ever heard that sheep will die if they aren't shorn, that is true for some modern breeds. But that is because humans have selectively bred them to be that way. The wild sheep that domesticated sheep are descended from did not need to be shorn, they rooed. Rooing is where the fleece comes off naturally. If you've ever seen an Angora rabbit shed, it's a lot like that. So on a rooing sheep at the right time of year, you could just walk up to them and gently pluck the whole fleece off by hand. There are modern sheep breeds that still roo: Shetland sheep, Soay sheep, and Icelandic sheep, for example. I was able to find a video from an Ontario-based farm that raises Icelandic sheep, and they found that you can roo an entire fleece from an adult ram in about 20 minutes. This is roughly the same amount of time it takes to shear a sheep using traditional shears. But it did not answer my question about early medieval British sheep. So I emailed Dr. Debbie Banham of the University of Cambridge, who is possibly the top academic on Anglo-Saxon agriculture. I asked her about evidence for rooing in pre-conquest Britain, and she said, we don't have anything in the written sources, but just because nobody wrote it down doesn't mean it didn't happen. She then recommended me her book, Anglo-Saxon Farms and Farming. I'm about a third of a way through, and it is amazing and is giving me lots of ideas for lots of things. I also emailed Butser Ancient Farm, a living history farm in the UK, and they referred me to Alan West, an exceptionally knowledgeable gentleman who told me all kinds of information about the kinds of sheep that would have been in Britain in the early medieval period. Basically, you would have had a mix of sheep descended from the pre-Roman sheep, just a few steps from domestication, sheep imported by the Romans from Mediterranean stock, sheep imported by the Saxons of Germanic stock, sheep imported by the Scandinavians, and a considerable diversity within those 4 types. Shearing goes back to at least 3500 BC in the Mediterranean, so we can pretty safely assume that the Roman stock would have been of the finer wool, shearing needed type. All the others would have likely been primitive rooing types. The pre-Roman and Scandinavian sheep would have rooed for sure. Dr. Banham's book also heavily emphasizes that there would have been a lot of diversity in the livestock of the early Middle Ages in the British Isles, even within the same regions and the same flocks in some cases. From what I understand, Mr. Alan West believes that most early medieval British sheep would have rooed. And I think that is a reasonable assumption based on what we have been able to piece together. Rooing is convenient, requires no specialized skills, and no specialized tools. Metal was very precious in early medieval Britain, so metal tools were at a premium. Even now, in the age of electric clippers, sheep shearing still requires significant skill. From this perspective, rooing sheep would have been very practical, very economical. However, the wool of rooing sheep is coarser, and you have less control over when it is collected. Larger, wealthier farms that could acquire finer wool types and had the manpower for specialized processes might have had some non-rooing sheep, but they were likely the exception, not the norm. But again, there was a lot of genetic diversity amongst all domesticated animals in this time period, particularly in this region. I keep referring to the early medieval sheep as types instead of breeds because breeds are a fairly modern invention. There were no sheep breeds 1,000 years ago. This is where a lot of people get into trouble. You have to be very careful when you are assuming things about early medieval sheep based on modern sheep. There is no modern sheep today that looks and performs exactly like early medieval sheep. As I have mentioned, there are breeds, sometimes called heritage or primitive breeds, that share traits and features that would have been present in early medieval sheep, but there are none that are exactly the same. 1,000+ years of human intervention will do that. Early medieval Britain would have had a mix of rooing and non-rooing sheep, but but probably more ROOING than not. But again, this is the sort of thing that nobody seems to have written down, just because while the vast majority of people in the Anglo-Saxon period would have been subsistence farmers, this information was not seen as important enough to record. After all this research, I really wanted to write about ROOING in book 3. I also wanted to emphasize the scarcity and value of metal in this world. The death by 1,000 snips was part of Edric's backstory on Valdar. I swapped the shears for an eating knife, still a very slow and painful way to behead a person, because Valdar is based largely on Iceland, and Icelandic sheep love a good roo. Tears of the Wolf, Book 1 is out now. Oath of the Wolf, Book 2 starts audiobook recording in August, and we are on track for an October release date. For Bukala!